Welcome. My name is Rabbi Daniel Nevins. I'm the Dean of the Rabbinical School at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I'm a member of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. I actually began as the secretary for the Law Committee back when I was a student in 1992 to 94. And then 5 years after my ordination, I became a member of the committee and have been serving on it ever since. My topics of interest within my work on the Law Committee fall into two broad categories. One regards social change. The other regards technology. In the former category, I have focused on topics having to do with disabilities, gender, and sexuality, and how new insights into these important areas of our lives relate to the ancient texts, norms, and values of Jewish tradition. In the second category, technology, I've been looking at how technology has been disrupting many of our traditional ways of life. In particular, I'm interested in topics such as the definition of death, the introduction of artificial intelligence, the kashrut of new food products such as cultured meat, and in general, in the genetic modification of life. It is this topic of genetic engineering which will be the focus of our study today. Humans have been tinkering with life forms since the dawn of history, breeding plants and animals to meet their needs. Pretty much nothing that we eat is actually natural, and that also applies to the mayflowers in our gardens. Charles Darwin spoke about two forms of variation. Variation under domestication, where people choose plants and animals for qualities which are desirable, and also natural variation that happens and is the force behind evolution. What's different today is that scientists have learned not only how to select beneficial mutations, but even to cause them. This began with some rather crude methods, such as subjecting organisms to radiation to cause mutations. It then went on to the use of viruses as vectors to introduce snippets of foreign DNA into an organism. But in recent years, a new system called CRISPR-Cas9 has been developed. With this new technology, scientists are able, with very little expense and difficulty, to introduce very accurate changes in the genome of a plant or an animal. These gene edits can be used to repair damage done to an organism, fixing its somatic or mature cells. However, it is also possible to introduce changes to germline cells, such as sperm and eggs, and to create changes which will be inherited by future generations of that line. These changes and these technologies have spread across the globe. They've raised a great deal of excitement, but also many ethical concerns. The most compelling motivation for the use of CRISPR is to address single gene mutations that cause some dreadful diseases, such as sickle cell anemia and Tay-Sachs and Huntington's disease. For the first time in our history, it is possible not only to treat the symptoms of these diseases, but even to repair them and to cure them. Surprisingly, CRISPR is used not only to remove mutations, but sometimes even to import mutations which are beneficial. For example, there is a very rare mutation called PCSK9, the name of a gene that creates a protein that regulates the levels of cholesterol in the bloodstream. A few families in the world have this variation, which causes them to have lower levels of cholesterol. As a result of that, they also have lower levels of coronary heart disease. Obviously, if this mutation could be shared with other families, it could have a great benefit in lowering risk for one of the greatest killers affecting humans. Genetic engineering is being used not only to improve human health, but also to improve the quality of the plants and animals that we benefit from. For example, it may be possible to modify plants so that they can grow in harsher conditions with more brackish water or a drier condition. They can also be modified to resist fungus and predators so that the plants can be grown in a changing environment. Genetic modifications may also be made to allow foods to grow faster, to be tastier, or to have an improved nutritional content. These applications of genetic engineering are compelling, and they are already happening in many places in the world. And yet, many of us have a general sense of unease at the rapid pace of innovation and the fact that life is changing in such dramatic fashion. What are some of the religious concerns, and specifically the Jewish Halakhic concerns, that can deepen and guide our conversation? Today we will be studying texts which will raise many of these concerns and allow us to join in this conversation. We're going to need both thumbs for this segment. On the one hand, we are custodians of this magnificent world that God has created, and we have an obligation to preserve it as we found it. Maimonides, the great medieval philosopher, taught us to study nature as a way of studying God's works. The Torah has a commandment not to mix different types of plants and animals and form new hybrids. This is called kilayim. If we mix these different hybrids, it's as if we're saying that we too are creators, as opposed to custodians of the beautiful world that God has created. On the other hand, God places us in this world to work it and to improve it. We are supposed to feed the poor, and that means that we have to learn new ways of farming. We're supposed to heal the sick, and that means we have to find new ways of healing. As Rabbi Seymour Siegel once said, Judaism teaches us not to worship nature, but to worship God. God wants us to choose life, and often that means improving the quality of life for ourselves and for all that lives in the world. The Torah itself provides us with an example of Jacob, our patriarch. In his story with Laban's flocks, he figures out a way to breed his sheep and goats so that they will have qualities that benefit him. As in so many areas, our Jewish sources are complicated and nuanced. In some ways, as in the rule of kilayim, they teach us not to make changes to preserve the world as we find it. In other stories, such as that of Jacob, we learn about the importance of making changes to improve the world around us. I call the first form of text the discourse of preservation, and the second kind of text a discourse of intervention. Both are part of our tradition, but which applies to this case? I could spell out reasons to support one discourse or the other, but I'd like to leave that to you. Read these texts, let them speak to you. What do you hear from them? And don't be afraid to speak back to them. Your voice is also important in the expanded discourse which will collectively become our Torah. This is what Judaism teaches us of the divine will. God commands us to study the Torah, to read it, to listen to it, to inquire, to debate. And that final process is what we will understand to be the revelation and will lead us to live lives of wisdom and virtue together. I hope that you enjoyed studying these texts. I'm a bit curious what you thought of Nachmanides or Ramban. Do you think he was working with false assumptions? After all, he seems to believe that the world and all the species within it have been stable and unchanged since the time of creation. If that's what he thinks, and that's not what we think, does that invalidate his insights? Nachmanides may also have been motivated by a mystical idea that there is a spiritual realm that guides the physical realm within which we live. Does that approach inspire you or invalidate his ideas? Looking to the Maharal, he's most famous, for the folktale of the creation of the golem, the mud monster that protected the Jews of Prague. Perhaps you can see a hint at that in his defense of the idea of Adam creating a new creature. Folktales aside, do you find that this interventionist perspective that humans can and perhaps ought to diversify nature, to perfect God's creation, to be inspiring or alarming? So, do you want to know what I think? It's too complicated to say in this short video. I'd like you to read my entire responsum and you'll have plenty of insight into my perspective. If you need to, skip ahead to the conclusions at the very end, and you'll find my thoughts about the genetic modification of plants, animals, and humans, and on the different motivations, whether it is to enhance nutrition or to protect human health. We do have great concerns with the changes that might undermine the sense of the sanctity of life and our humility as creatures of God. Thank you for joining this day of Halakhic Study. May God bless us all with wisdom and righteousness as we confront complicated subjects in the years to come.